From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
Here in Washington, D.C., fighting against this tax bill because it would mandate enormous cuts to Medicare disability that would likely prevent me from getting the medical equipment I need to stay alive. And
Protests continue on Capitol Hill as Congress approves a massive rewrite of the U.S. tax code that could mean the largest transfer of wealth from the bottom to the top in U.S. history, while ending a central pillar of President Obama's signature health care law. As President Trump celebrates his first major legislative victory, Congress negotiates a stopgap spending measure that will not include the DREAM Act. We'll speak with Erica Andiola, just out of jail, one of 7 undocumented immigrants released after 6 days. She's on hunger strike after a sit-in at the offices of Democratic lawmakers.
We're here in Senator Schumer's office, and we have a very simple demand. Either he chooses to send the 4 of us to jail, where we're not going to give our names, where we're going to stay there as long as it takes, where we can stay there for days, and every day that passes is a day that is getting closer to us being sent to immigration.
Then to an exclusive jailhouse interview with award-winning Mexican journalist Emilio Gutierrez Soto, who's fighting deportation from a Texas jail. He came to the U.S. seeking help after he reported on Mexican military corruption, and they threatened his life.
It would appear that I would need to enter the United States with bullet holes on the front and back of my body, or mutilated, which is what the institutional criminal group, the Mexican government, generally does.
And a new report by the ACLU of Texas and The Intercept, they're taking everybody. Videos show Texas troopers ripping apart immigrant families during traffic stops.
Cams started coming in. I realized, wow, this is really a record of a deportation machine, of state troopers fishing for people on the highways and then turning them into federal immigration officials.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The Republican-controlled Congress has approved a massive rewrite of the U.S. tax code that will overwhelmingly benefit corporations and the wealthiest Americans, while ending a central pillar of President Obama's signature health care law. The tax bill cleared the Senate early Wednesday, then House lawmakers approved it 224 to 201. This is President Trump.
These are the people right behind me. They've worked so long, so hard. It's been an amazing experience, I have to tell you. Hasn't been done in 34 years, but actually really hasn't been done because we broke every record. It's the largest, I always say the most massive, but it's the largest tax cut in the history of our country. And reform, but tax cut. Really something special.
President Trump reportedly may sign the tax bill at his ritzy private Florida resort, Mar-a-Lago. Experts estimate Trump himself will personally benefit from a tax cut of up to $15 million a year. Democratic lawmakers have slammed the measure, which experts say will benefit big corporations, multimillionaires, private equity managers, and President Trump and his family, while hurting the elderly, low-income families, immigrants, people buying health insurance, and the island of Puerto Rico. This is Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer of New York.
Now, we know they're popping champagne down Pennsylvania Avenue. There are only 2 places where America's popping champagne: the White House and the corporate boardrooms, including Trump Tower. Otherwise, Americans have a lot to regret.
The new tax code will slash the corporate tax rate from 35% to 21%. President Trump has repeatedly claimed the benefits to corporations will trickle down to workers, but a number of corporate giants, including Pfizer and Coca-Cola, have said they'll give the windfall from the tax cuts to their shareholders, not their workers. The tax bill will also repeal the individual health insurance mandate, which experts say will cause insurance premiums to skyrocket. The Congressional Budget Office estimates 13 million Americans are projected to lose their health insurance under the plan. Hundreds of Dreamers flooded Capitol Hill Wednesday as Congress negotiates a stopgap spending measure that will not include a version of the DREAM Act, which would grant legal status to recipients of the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or DACA program. It appears that Congress is moving towards approving a one-month stopgap that will fund the government into January without resolving key political issues such as immigration. This comes as 7 DACA recipients and 1 ally were released from jail Wednesday after 6 days on hunger strike. The group was arrested Friday during nonviolent sit-in protests inside the offices of New York Senator Chuck Schumer and Florida Republican Congressmember Carlos Corbello. The activists were demanding the lawmakers commit to voting no on a spending bill this month unless it includes a version of the DREAM Act without concessions for funding for the border wall or enhanced border security. We'll speak with Erica Andiola after headlines, one of those DACA recipients on hunger strike just released from jail. The top Democrat on the Senate Intelligence Committee, Mark Warner of Virginia, took to the Senate floor Wednesday to warn the Trump administration against firing special counsel Robert Mueller, who's leading the investigation into whether the Trump campaign colluded with Russia during the 2016 presidential election.
Firing Mr. Mueller or any other of the top brass involved in this investigation would not only call into question this administration's commitment to the truth, but also to our most basic concept, rule of law. It also has the potential to provoke a constitutional crisis. In the United States of America, no one is above the law, not even the president.
Senator Warner's comments come as a number of Republicans are criticizing the Mueller investigation. Senator Warner says he's concerned the Trump administration might fire Mueller during Congress's Christmas recess. The White House said Wednesday it's not planning to fire Mueller. At the United Nations General Assembly, the vast majority of countries are slated to vote today on a resolution that opposes President Trump's decision to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital, as Trump has launched a furious lobbying campaign against the vote, even threatening to cut off U.S. funding to countries that vote against his decision.
I like the message that Nikki sent yesterday at the United Nations. For all of these nations that take our money and then they vote against us at the Security Council, or they vote against us potentially at the Assembly. They take hundreds of millions of dollars and even billions of dollars, and then they vote against us. Well, we're watching those votes. Let them vote against us. We'll save a lot. We don't care.
President Trump sparked international condemnation when he announced earlier this month the U.S. would recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital and move the U.S. embassy there. Control of Jerusalem is one of the most contested issues. Palestinians see East Jerusalem as the capital of their future state. Sustained protests continue in the Israel-occupied Palestinian territories despite a brutal Israeli military crackdown. On Wednesday, dozens of Palestinian protesters were wounded after Israeli soldiers opened fire with live ammunition and tear gas against thousands of protesters. This is Hamas official Ismail Radwan.
We call on our Arabic and Muslim nations to surround the Israeli and American embassies in the Arab countries, then drive the American and Israeli ambassadors out of the Arab countries. We are continuing our way of resistance, using all kinds of resistance to break this decision.
President Trump has reportedly raised the issue of the ongoing war and humanitarian crisis in Yemen on a phone call with British Prime Minister Theresa May. The U.S.-backed Saudi-led bombing campaign and blockade in Yemen has killed more than 10,000 people and sparked a cholera epidemic and near famine. The United Nations Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Speech says he's concerned the Federal Communications Commission's decision to repeal landmark net neutrality laws last week could impact the freedom of information worldwide. This is David Kay.
If the American system somehow restricts the ability of information to get out in the U.S., that will obviously also have an impact on the availability of information to the rest of the world about information in the U.S., perhaps about academic and scientific information, health information.
In Honduras, a brutal military crackdown against protesters supporting the opposition party continues, with multiple people killed and dozens more wounded in recent days amidst the ongoing political crisis. On Wednesday, the United States signaled its support for the incumbent U.S.-backed President Juan Orlando Hernández, who was declared the winner of the November 26 election late Sunday night by the government-controlled election board. The opposition party, the Alliance Against the Dictatorship, as well as the Organization of American States, have called for new elections amidst reports of widespread fraud and vote rigging. A senior State Department official said the U.S. has no credible evidence to dispute Hernandez's victory. But across Honduras, protests continue against what many are calling an electoral coup. There are reports the military has assassinated and beaten protesters, including attacking protesters in the hospital, shooting tear gas into people's homes, including where there are children and pregnant women, and launching a violent crackdown against Afro-Indigenous Garifuna protesters. In Colombia, the United Nations says more than 100 human rights activists and community leaders have been murdered this year. The United Nations says most of the activists killed were Afro-Colombian and indigenous, and that the most dangerous regions are places where the FARC has withdrawn from power following a peace deal reached last year. Community groups say land defenders are especially targeted for assassination. In Mexico, journalist Gumaro Perez Aguinaldo has been assassinated in the southern state of Veracruz, becoming at least the 12th journalist to be killed in Mexico this year. He was attending a Christmas pageant at his son's school in the city of Acayucan when armed men burst into the classroom and murdered him in front of a room filled with school children. Perez covered police for multiple outlets, including the news site he founded, La Voz del Sur, or The Voice of the South. He's at least the third journalist murdered in the city of Acayucan in Veracruz in recent months. This comes as, in Texas, an award-winning Mexican journalist is fighting against deportation back to Mexico. He's currently in immigration detention, saying he fears for his life if he is deported. We'll go to an exclusive jailhouse interview with him later in the broadcast. And the European Union is threatening to strip Poland of its voting rights in Brussels as the right-wing Polish government overhauls the judiciary despite deep public opposition. Polish protesters and the European Union say a slew of recent legislation, including 2 new laws signed by Polish President Andrzej Duda on Wednesday, undermine the independence of the courts. This is European Union official Frans Timmermans.
Sadly, our concerns have deepened. Within a period of 2 years, a significant numbers of laws have been adopted, 13 in total, which put at serious risk the independence of the judiciary and the separation of powers in Poland.
The Trump administration has approved an export license that will allow Ukraine to buy weapons and firearms from U.S. arms manufacturers. The approval represents a lifting of the Obama-era de facto restrictions on arms exports to Ukraine, although there was never a formal ban. The move comes amidst an ongoing conflict between Ukraine and Russia in which 10,000 people have been killed since 2014. In Peru, a political crisis is escalating as the Congress is slated to vote today on whether to impeach President Pedro Pablo Kuczynski. He faces charges of having attempted to conceal his business ties to the Brazilian construction firm Odebrecht, which is at the center of a massive corruption scandal that's spread across Latin America. Back in the United States and Virginia, judges have now declared the race for a pivotal Virginia House of Delegates seat tied, only 1 day after a recount showed that the Democrat Shelley Simons won by 1 vote. The judges now say Simons is exactly tied with her challenger, Republican incumbent David Yancey. In the balance hangs control of the Virginia House of Delegates. Under Virginia law, the tie will now be broken by lot. effectively, though not exactly, a coin flip. Olympic gold medalist Michaela Maroney has sued USA Gymnastics, saying officials paid her to keep silent about sexual abuse by team doctor Larry Nassar. The Wall Street Journal reports USA Gymnastics paid Maroney $1.25 million to sign a non-disclosure agreement. Her lawyer says the gold medalist signed the non-disclosure because she needed the money for life-saving psychological treatment as a result of the trauma from her doctor's sexual abuse. Dozens of female athletes, including members of the U.S. Olympics gymnastics team, have accused Nassar of penetrating their vaginas with his fingers and covering up the abuse by pretending it was part of a medical treatment. And the Swedish parliament is slated to approve legislation today that would change its rape laws in order to place the burden of proof onto the accused attacker, not on the alleged victim. Under the new sexual consent legislation, people will have to receive affirmative verbal or physical action demonstrating consent before initiating sexual contact. In explaining the legislation, the Swedish Prime Minister said, quote, "It should be obvious. Sex should be voluntary. If it is not voluntary, then it is illegal. If you are unsure, then refrain," unquote. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Narmeen Sheikh. Welcome to our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. Congress has approved a massive rewrite of the U.S. tax code that could mean the largest transfer of wealth from the bottom to the top in history and will end a central pillar of President Obama's signature health care law. The tax bill cleared the Senate early Wednesday. Then House lawmakers approved it 224 to 201, clearing the way for President Trump to sign it into law. House Speaker Paul Ryan praised Trump for, quote, exquisite presidential leadership. This is Trump celebrating his first major legislative victory.
We broke every record. It's the largest, I always say the most massive, but it's the largest tax cut in the history of our country, and reform, but tax cut. Really something special. Records all over the place, and that will continue, and then some because of what we did. But $3.2 trillion, just think of it, in tax cuts for American families, including doubling the standard deduction and doubling the child tax credit. The typical family of four earning $75,000 will see an income tax cut of more than $2,000. They're going to have $2,000, and that's, in my opinion, going to be less than the average. You're going to have a lot more than that. We are making America great again.
But the Republicans' massive tax overhaul faces overwhelming public opposition. An analysis by the Tax Policy Institute found that by 2027, the tax bill would give the wealthiest 1% of Americans 83% of the tax cut. Experts estimate Trump will personally benefit from a tax cut of up to $15 million a year. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer denounced the measure Wednesday.
Now, we know they're popping champagne down Pennsylvania Avenue. There are only two places where America's popping champagne: the White House and the corporate boardrooms, including Trump Tower. Otherwise, Americans have a lot to regret.
President Trump reportedly may sign the tax bill at his ritzy private Florida resort, Mar-a-Lago. Estimates are he stands to gain up to $15 million in tax in the new tax bill. Meanwhile, hundreds of dreamers flooded Capitol Hill Wednesday as Congress is negotiating a stopgap spending measure that will not include the DREAM Act, which would grant legal status to recipients of the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals Program, or DACA. This comes as 7 young DACA recipients and one ally were released from jail Wednesday after 6 days in jail on hunger strike. The 8 were arrested Friday during nonviolent sit-in protests inside the offices of New York Senator Chuck Schumer and Florida Republican Congressmember Carlos Curbelo. The activists were demanding the lawmakers commit to voting no on the spending bill this month unless it includes a version of the DREAM Act without concessions for funding for the border wall or enhanced border security. President Trump rescinded DACA in September leaving dreamers at risk of losing work permits and deportation protections they received under the program. Nearly 700,000 dreamers will eventually be in danger of being deported as their 2-year permits expire. Beginning early next year, 1,000 young people will lose their protection from deportation each day. For more, we go to Washington, D.C., where we're joined by Erica Andiola, one of the 8 activists just released from jail late Wednesday after being arrested Friday. Andiola is a nationally known immigrant rights activist who served as a spokesperson for the Bernie Sanders campaign and helped him craft immigration policy. She's the political director for Our Revolution. She's a DACA recipient. She's a dreamer who grew up in Arizona. In 2013, her house was raided and immigration agents picked up her mother and brother. Erica Andiola, welcome back to Democracy Now! You've just come off of a hunger strike. You've just been released from jail. Can you talk about why you were protesting on Friday, what happened, and what you're demanding now?
Yes, of course. Good morning, Amy. You know, for us, the time is now. We have been waiting for too long to pass the DREAM Act. I started organizing in 2009 for the DREAM Act, and this bill was actually introduced since 2001. So it's been 17 years, and we still have not been able to have a piece of legislation that has been supported by more than 70% of Americans. That is a bipartisan bill. That there's absolutely no question of why, you know, it still hasn't passed. And for me, my only answer is that it's just been played as a political football by both parties, Democrats and Republicans. And so for us, it was important to go to Senator Schumer's office and give him a very, very important demand, which is for him to use his power as the leader of the minority in the Senate, and to make sure that everybody who he actually is able to whip votes no on the spending bill if the DREAM Act is not added. Unfortunately, we went to jail for 6 days. It was definitely not a place where I wanted to be. And we risked all of this because we had the courage to do so. And unfortunately, I just came out of jail last night and heard that Senator Schumer didn't even have the courage to meet our demand. And so we're still pushing, and there's still time. They still have time to do this.
So Erica Andiola, do you have any idea, because of course you protested there at Schumer's office, why the Democrats didn't in the end vote no, despite initially pledging or giving the impression that they would?
You know, I think for me, I know that Democrats actually, you know, say they support the DREAM Act. Every time they go and you know, try to get re-elected in their elections, they always use the DREAM Act as a way to get, you know, Latino voters and other folks who support it. But when it comes to actually trying to pass it, there's no will. And it's been years. In 2010, it failed by 5 votes in the Senate. Guess how many Democrats didn't vote for the bill or voted no? 5 Democrats. And so the fact is that the party could do this if they wanted to. Right now, you know, they don't have a majority. Republicans do, but they do have the leverage of how much, you know, of the votes that they need to pass the spending bill. And so we're asking Senator Schumer to step up and do that, to stop playing with our lives. And the fact is that dreamers are already getting deported. As soon as I got into the jail, ICE was called on me. And nothing happened to me because there was so much pressure from the outside. But the fact is that this will happen to dreamers if we don't pass the DREAM Act. And it's on Schumer and it's on Republicans to make sure that, you know, there is a fix now, and that we're not waiting for more people to get deported, and to wait until 2018 does not work, because elections are going to start happening. And you know how that changes everything in America.
I'd like to turn to Senator Dick Durbin. Being asked about the Democrats' position on DACA, Durbin was interviewed earlier this week by CBS host John Dickerson on Face the Nation.
A number of your Democratic supporters, colleagues, would like you as a Democrat to basically make funding of the government, to keep the government running, would like you to make it contingent on doing something about DACA. Will you?
Well, I can tell you this, we don't want to see the government shut down. We want to move forward in a bipartisan fashion to solve our problems. We believe that DACA is central. The president is the one who made this the issue. September the 5th, he eliminated the DACA program and put in doubt the future of over 780,000 people in America. And we want to get this done and accomplished.
So that was earlier this week. AP is reporting just as we went to air that House Republicans early Thursday unveiled a new stripped-down spending bill to prevent a government shutdown this weekend and allow quarreling lawmakers to punt most of their unfinished business into the new year. It would stave off a government shutdown till January 19th to allow the Congress members to go home for the holidays. Meanwhile, what is the number? Something like 122 young people, DACA recipients, every day lose their DACA status and suffer job loss. Erica Andiola, so what now, as Congress is in the last throes of this and you are pushing for them to include the DREAM Act in the spending bill, will you do? And also explain the DREAM Act you want to see passed.
Absolutely. And I want to also clarify, and just hearing Senator Durbin, we don't want a government shutdown. That's not what we're working for or towards. Nobody wants to see the government shutdown. What we want to see is the DREAM Act be included in this bill. And the reason for that is that, we think that passing the DREAM Act in that bill makes the likelihood of it passing a lot more. It can actually pass. And not only that, we want it to be clean, meaning that we cannot have something in there that's going to push our families and our parents and our communities deeper into the shadows, like more enforcement, like more funding for ICE, like less funding for cities that have sanctuary policies. And so, it's not right. Like right now, the American public supports the DREAM Act by itself. There's no reason to add anything else and use undocumented youth as bargaining chips. This is not a game. And like I said, we've been waiting for so long, we were fighting for so long, and this is the time for both parties to, do what they have been saying for so many years, that they support this bill, that they support us dreamers, and this is the time to do what is right.
Erica Andiola, you said earlier that ICE called on you. Could you explain what that means and what the implications of that are, and how many people are at risk of that happening?
Yeah, the fact is that, when you're undocumented, you can, get out of your house, maybe drive, do anything that any other American would do and get stopped by the police. You end up in their custody. And what happens is that many times the police calls ICE on you, even if, they might not even know you're undocumented, but you're a brown person or you're a person of color. Or, there's many other reasons why, they think that you're undocumented and they will call ICE on you. I didn't give my information. I didn't say anything. And next thing you know, there was already a call placed from the police to ICE asking them about me and asking if, I was undocumented. And so this is something that happens every single day. This is something that's already happening with Dreamers and everybody else in our communities. And so what we're telling Chuck Schumer, and I did this action at his office telling him, do you want that to be our future? Do you want people like myself to continue to go through that? Do you want people who are not even a public, figure or who are not activists to go through this without anybody seeing it? That is going to be the reality if we don't pass the DREAM Act.
Before we go, and we're going to go to an exclusive jailhouse interview with a Mexican journalist who is fighting deportation back to Mexico. Erica, you were a major spokesperson for the Bernie Sanders campaign. Massive, historic legislation was passed yesterday as you were in jail protesting around the issue of the DREAM Act. And that is the tax bill, which will be the largest transfer of wealth from the bottom to the top in U.S. history. And I'm wondering your thoughts on this. Also, President Trump, I guess you could say, saying that with taking away the individual mandate on the health care, on the signature Obamacare, that he has killed Obamacare within the tax bill.
Yeah, it was something that I thought it was probably going to happen, and it's just upsetting to come out of the jail and see that this actually did happen. But What gives me hope is that before I went inside of the jail, a couple of days before that, I saw that Alabama had a huge win, and also that next year is election time. And I see that people are awake, people are ready to go out to vote, and I hope that that's the case in 2018 and that we can really turn this around. This is really about, stop complaining. All of us, we need to, even myself, I need to stop complaining and actually, take the streets, take the polls, go vote, and make sure that we are having people running for office all over the nation, just like Bernie Sanders told us to do. I can't run for office, I can't vote, but look, I decided to go into a jail to fight for what I believe in, and I think this is the moment that everybody should be doing everything you can to turn this around, because this is not going to last forever. We can't let it last forever, and it's in our hands.
Erica Andiola, very quickly before we go, you're going to be speaking at a press conference later this morning. Can you talk about that? What's your message to Democrats?
Our message is what I've been saying previously, is that we are having dreamers deported now. We are having dreamers losing DACA, and we cannot, we don't even know how else to ask Democrats to actually not just speak about us and tell our stories, but actually act and do what it needs to be done, use their leverage. We don't want a government shutdown. What we want is for the DREAM Act to be in the spending bill, and they have the power to do it. They have the leverage, and this is a time to show that they really care about our communities.
Erica Andiola, we thank you for being with us. DACA recipient, nationally known immigrants' rights activist, served as spokesperson for Bernie Sanders, helped him craft immigration policy. Released Wednesday after being arrested last week with 7 other DACA recipients and an ally peacefully protesting at the offices of New York Congressmember Chuck Schumer. We are going to continue, of course, to cover this story day by day. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, our exclusive jailhouse interview with a Mexican journalist, fearful if he's deported, he will die. Stay with us. By the Soul Jazz Orchestra here on Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
We turn now to the danger facing journalists in Mexico and how the U.S. has responded to one of them. This week, Mexican journalist Gumaro Perez Aguinaldo was assassinated in the southern state of Veracruz, becoming at least the 12th journalist to be killed in Mexico so far this year. He was attending a Christmas pageant at his son's school in the city of Acayucan when armed men burst into the classroom and murdered him in front of a room filled with school children. Perez covered police for multiple outlets, including the news site he founded, La Voz del Sur, or The Voice of the South. He's at least the 3rd journalist murdered in the city of Acayucan in recent months. His death marked the 12th murder of a media worker in Mexico in 2017, according to the press freedom organization Reporters Without Borders. The killing puts Mexico alongside Syria as the most murderous country for journalists, according to RSF.
Well, in a broadcast exclusive today, we conducted a jailhouse interview by phone with another Mexican journalist, Emilio Gutierrez Soto, who's fighting his deportation to Mexico as he's being held in a U.S. detention center in El Paso, Texas. Gutierrez first sought asylum in the United States in 2008 after receiving death threats for reporting on alleged corruption in the Mexican military. He was detained then, eventually released, while his asylum appeal was pending. Well, last week, his asylum appeal was denied. He now faces deportation back to Mexico, one of the most dangerous countries in the world for journalists. Democracy Now's Juan Gonzalez and I had a chance to speak with Gutierrez directly in detention, where he is in jail in El Paso.
Sí, mire, Juan, yo escribí algunas notas informativas.
Look, Juan, I wrote some articles where I described how the military acting in the northwest of Chihuahua, specifically in the municipality of Ascension, Chihuahua, and particularly the population of Palomas, which is by the border with the state of New Mexico. This caused disgust at the Ministry of Defense, which sent the head of the 5th Military Zone in Chihuahua, General Garcia Vega, to threaten me, saying I'd already written 3 articles noting corruption and assaults against the population by members of the military. And he sentenced me. He said, you've written 3 articles, and there's not going to be a 4th one. And of course, there was a 4th article, and I filed a complaint with the Human Rights Commission and also with the Office of the Attorney General for the state. As a result, for a time, after those threats, they sought some sort of reconciliation with me, but the terms never came about. In this state of affairs, I was somewhat fearful in the face of a serious warning by a general, a high-level commander from the Mexican Army. Back in 2008, the Army forcibly entered my home, knocking down the main door, threatening us with their firearms. They threw me to the floor, and they said they were searching for weapons and drugs. They destroyed our home, and, of course, they found nothing at all. And, once again, great fear has come, such that I had to stay up all night while my son was sleeping. I had to look out the window to see who might be coming by. And my sleep, well, I would catch up on my sleep at the office while at the same time doing my work as a journalist. A month later, on May 5th, at night, after they broke into our house and had destroyed our house, we took more precautions. And on June 16th, 2008, we decided to enter the United States seeking political asylum. First, we said that the military were keeping close surveillance over me, and that a friend of mine told me that a relative of hers in the Repeat Response elite group told her that there was a plan to kill me. Obviously, I had to quickly take what I needed from my home. I went to a friend of a home where my son was. There was a religious service going on there. And we went to a ranch on Saturday, July 14th. And on the 16th, we opted to cross into the United States at the border post of Berrendo into the state of New Mexico, where we placed ourselves at the disposal of U.S. immigration officials seeking political asylum.
Was it your intention to move to the United States, or did you just feel that you had to as a result of the threats to your life?
No, lo hicimos ya con la intención de movernos de una manera permanente porque...
No, we did this with the intention of moving permanently, because when there is a threat by the military, it's very serious. Plus, there were already antecedents in terms of how the military were acting. And in some cases, people would not appear again.
Emilio, can you talk about what deportation would mean? First, describe where you are in the El Paso jail, and then what would it mean if you were sent back to Mexico?
Bueno, una deportación de nosotros implica.
Well, if we are deported, that obviously implies death. Why? Because ICE, under the Department of Homeland Security of the United States, by law, must give a report to the immigration authorities of Mexico and the consulate. And the immigration officials in Mexico have no credibility. It's impossible to trust in them. To the contrary, many of those officials, many personnel at the consulate or immigration service are caught up with organized crime. And organized crime is precisely the Mexican government. If the government didn't give its consent for criminal groups to work with impunity, certainly the conditions would be different. But the government of Mexico facilitates the work of criminal groups who operate with total impunity. The government of Mexico, we all know, is the most corrupt government in the hemisphere and obviously enjoys no credibility. Now, the conditions we find ourselves at this ICE jail in El Paso are truly denigrating. We have seen, my son and myself, most of the immigrants detained here are from Central and South America, the majority. We're not so many Mexicans here at this jail. Now, given the extreme poverty, well, of course, that is experienced in Mexico, but even more so in Central and South America, for many of the persons detained, it seems that the conditions are adequate, are pleasant, but they are denigrating.
La comida es, aparte de pobre nutricionalmente,
the food is poor nutritionally.
No es de ninguna manera agradable consumir.
It is not pleasant at all to eat the food here. Not at all. Plus, the rations, the portions are too small.
And Emilio, the immigration authorities here in the United States are saying that you have no proof, no documentary proof of your claims, or that no witnesses have appeared to back up your claims. How do you respond to that?
Yo creo que las autoridades migratorias son una institución.
I believe that the immigration authorities are an institution based on lies. It would appear that I would need to enter the United States with bullet holes on the front and back of my body or mutilated, which is what the institutional criminal group, the Mexican government, generally does.
That's Mexican journalist Emilio Gutierrez Soto speaking in an exclusive jailhouse broadcast interview from a U.S. detention center in El Paso, where he is fighting his deportation to Mexico, one of the most dangerous countries in the world for journalists.
Gutierrez first sought asylum in the United States in 2008 after receiving death threats for reporting on alleged corruption in the Mexican military. He was detained then and eventually released when his asylum appeal was pending. He lived free in the U.S. for nearly a decade. Last week, the Trump administration denied his asylum appeal. Well, for more, we're joined in El Paso, Texas, via a Democracy Now! Video stream by his lawyer, Eduardo Beckett. Eduardo Beckett, could you tell us what the situation is now with your client, Emilio Gutierrez?
Yes, good morning. It's an honor to be here. My client's asylum claim was actually denied on July 19th of 2017. He filed an appeal with the Board of Immigration Appeals. The appeal was dismissed on a technicality. At that moment, he could be deported at any time, so we filed a stay removal, both with the original immigration judge with a motion to reopen, a stay with ICE, and both of them were denied by the judge and denied by ICE. So we filed an emergency stay with the Board of Immigration Appeals and a motion to reopen. The stay removal by the Board of Immigration Appeals was granted, and his motion to reopen his asylum case is pending. What we're doing right now, we're trying to get him released on humanitarian parole. And as my client has told you, right now ICE is operating and basically on steroids, and And I would say that my client is a prototypical example of someone who should have been granted asylum. He's a journalist. He's has openly criticized the Mexican government for years and years, nonstop. His life is in great danger upon deportation. He has no criminal history. He entered legally, and yet ICE is treating him like a criminal. So this is the criminalization of asylum seekers. So that's the situation right now.
Eduardo Beckett, explain the grounds on which he was denied his claim for his request for political asylum here. I mean, we just reported today in our headlines and in this segment about yet another Mexican journalist who was gunned down in Mexico. As you heard in this interview, Emilio Gutierrez fears, of course, if he is deported, that is what will happen to him. He'll be assassinated. He's being detained with his son. Can you talk about the denial under the Trump administration, and what is his recourse now?
Of course. So the denial is basically like a 30-page document where the judge makes an analysis of the conditions in Mexico. And as you stated, the eyewitnesses from Mexico did not show up to the court, did not want to cooperate. And I understand 100% because they live in Mexico. So I believe that the witnesses were scared to come forward or to send an affidavit. Nevertheless, my client submitted many expert witness documents corroborating evidence, overwhelming evidence of the conditions of Mexico. And you know, like you mentioned, 12 journalists have been executed. A couple days ago, one in Veracruz in front of his children at a Christmas party. When I told my client what happened, he was crying and he was shaking and he was saying that he felt bad, that he knows that it's going to happen to him. So in this case, the judge got it wrong. So his recourse is to file a motion to reopen the case. And we're going to hopefully get to redo his whole case again, because I think the judge got it wrong. And the message that the judge is sending is basically saying, we don't want to protect journalists, and we don't think, you know, that you corroborated your asylum claim. But the U.S. Supreme Court only requires a 10% chance that upon deportation of Mexico, that you would be tortured or executed or persecuted. The Real ID Act of 2005 does require corroborating evidence if it's readily available and within reason. In this case, to force a witness to come forward at the risk that that witness might be executed is unreasonable. So those are the types of things that we're going to be asking the Board of Immigration Appeals to examine and overrule the judge and hopefully give us a new, the opportunity to retry his asylum claim.
And the role of the local Congress member, has he been visited by anyone locally in El Paso?
So what we're doing also, we're doing a campaign to shed light, you know, under the Trump administration, as you mentioned. We feel that the erosion of due process in an exaggerated rate. We're asking our local congressmen, we're asking our clergy, we're asking the community to support my client and to ask for his release. I did have a conversation with my congressman in Washington, D.C. yesterday, his staff.
And
we asked
he is who?
Congressman Beto O'Rourke. Beto O'Rourke?
Yes.
We had a meeting with him on the phone. I did not get to speak to him directly, but through his staff, and we asked him to support us and to put pressure on ICE to get my client released. Like I said, no criminal history. He's always complied with the law, and it's sad that he's being detained like a criminal. This is a guy that promotes democracy. This is a guy that we want here in the United States. And so we're reaching out not only to him, but to other senators and congressmen and anyone who wants to help. Journalists around the world have called us. So we have a lot of people that are supporting us That's why we're here today.
Eduardo
to highlight
Beckett,
this stuff.
I want to thank you so much for being with us. Lawyer for the detained journalist Emilio Gutierrez. He's detained in an immigration jail in El Paso, Texas. He applied for political asylum. He was just denied by the Trump administration. He is appealing that decision. He is in jail with his son. We will continue to follow the story. If you want to hear the whole interview with Emilio Gutierrez that I did with Juan Gonzalez, you can go to democracynow.org. This is Democracy Now! Stay with us.
Woke up from a movie I immediately forgot. Got a heartache on the bottom and a headache on the top. The part of me that hurts the worst is the one I just can't spot. And it's all American made. Well, everywhere I go, somebody puts me in the dirt. And everything I say, somebody says they said it first. But I don't need 10 million. Baby, just give me.
All American Made by Margot Price here on Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
We end the show in Texas, where a shocking new investigation has revealed how state troopers are essentially acting as deportation officers. After pouring through public records of traffic stops by the Texas Highway Patrol, the ACLU of Texas has uncovered what amounts to a deportation machine operated by the state's Department of Public Safety, or DPS. State troopers stop drivers for minor traffic infractions, and if they're unable to produce a driver's license, they're taken into custody and turned over to Border Patrol. The Intercept, working with the ACLU of Texas, obtained several DPS dash cam videos that show immigrants being detained for trivial traffic violations and then being carted away by Border Patrol. This is a clip from a video produced by The Intercept of dash cam video of a traffic stop and features Debbie Nathan, investigative reporter for the ACLU of Texas, our guest today.
I'm on a traffic stop. Can you send a Border Patrol agent over here?
Oh, they're gonna take it, sir. They're taking everyone.
Who said that?
Everybody's saying that. They're taking everyone. They're deporting them.
When the dash cam started coming in, I realized, wow, this is really a record of a deportation machine, of state troopers fishing for people on the highways and then turning them into federal immigration officials.
For more, we are joined by Debbie Nathan, investigative reporter for the ACLU of Texas. Her report for The Intercept headline, "They're Taking Everybody." Videos show Texas troopers ripping apart immigrant families during traffic stops. Debbie, welcome to Democracy Now! I'm glad you're in New York today to explain what is happening in Texas and what you found right where you live.
I live in Brownsville, Texas, which is right on the border at the easternmost part of the border. It's a 1,200-mile border that goes all the way to El Paso. And for the past few years, the state of Texas has been funding, mega funding, to the tune of right now it's like $800 million a year to have a lot of state troopers down on the border. They're brought in on tours. And they are empowered to stop people on the roads, as they traditionally have, doing traffic enforcement. So in the course of stopping people on the border for things like broken taillights or failing to signal when they do a lane change, they ask for their driver's licenses. Now, in Texas and many other states for the past few years, it's been impossible for undocumented people to get driver's licenses. Well, they have to drive. I mean, there's really no public transportation, and people have to go to work. So they drive, and they don't have licenses, and it becomes sort of like the opposite of a star on your sleeve, like not to have something. As soon as they say they don't have a driver's license, it triggers a call from the trooper to the Border Patrol. And the Border Patrol, there are thousands of them on the Texas border, so they're usually just a few minutes away, and they arrive quickly. And
are they interrogating them?
Well, the troopers are not supposed to do that, but they start the interrogation, and then the Border Patrol finishes it up. They have the legal right to do that once they arrive. But the interrogations often start, you know, when the troopers encounter the person. And I've seen, there's one video in the Intercept piece where a man tries to exercise his Fifth Amendment right not to say why he doesn't have a driver's license, and he's very much verbally abused. In a similar manner, actually, to the Sandra Bland encounter. These are the same agents. But, you know, it was my sense from looking at a lot of these videos, these dash cam videos that I got from the troopers, that, you know, I mean, even though that behavior is supposed to be really unacceptable, and they fired the agent who did it to Sandra Bland, it's allowed on the border with immigrants.
Well, presumably, state troopers and police in general stopped people and asked for driver's licenses for minor traffic violations in the past. What do you know about when they started reporting these violations, when people weren't able to produce a driver's license, undocumented people weren't able to produce a driver's license, and then state troopers started communicating with Border Patrol?
Well, it's my impression from looking at data, and I only have data that goes back about 2 years, and from hearing anecdotes from people in the community, and I've been down there 1 year, but people talk about this having happened in the last few years, but it was always sort of touch and go, because many times when I speak with people and they say, well, you know, I used to get stopped, and they would ask me if I had my driver's license, and I didn't, and they would just let me go. And that seems to be almost what the custom was until about a year ago. Now, a year ago, just a couple of days before the presidential election, DPS put out a memo to all of its staff saying, you have an obligation to call the Border Patrol when you suspect that someone is undocumented. You have an obligation. I actually heard from somebody like a whistleblower in the Department of Public Safety, the troopers, that had not been the custom or the obligation prior to the letter. So now it seems like they have to do it.
Now, Debbie Nathan, we introduced you as the investigative journalist for the ACLU, which is very interesting. I mean, we knew that model from Michigan, Kurt Guyette, with the ACLU, an investigative reporter who investigated the poisoning of an American city of Flint, Michigan. Explain this model. You're an investigative reporter with the ACLU.
So I'm an investigative reporter. I have many years of investigative reporting in a more traditional context with independent media. And what Kurt and I have both done is worked with community organizations to really develop our tips, to develop information that we can go out and document. I mean, and then to publish that in independent sources. So I'm not part of communications. I'm not a researcher or investigator, neither is he. We are investigative journalists.
Well, one of the people whose case you investigated was Ruth Ramirez. She was subjected to a traffic stop because of the tint in the windows of her truck, which were apparently too dark. She was turned over to Border Patrol, and you found her in Juarez, Mexico. This clip is from an interview you had with her as you showed her the dash cam video of her traffic stop.
I would simply describe it as the worst moment of my life.
To be handcuffed?
To be handcuffed, to be embarrassed, to be humiliated for no apparent reason.
But you were stone-faced.
Yes, because he had already had enough triumph to have turned me into immigration. I wasn't going to hand him the triumph of seeing me shed tears.
Yeah, this is starting to get old, man. Maybe I should have joined the Border Patrol.
It's very clear that to him, we undocumented people are like a trophy. He was making fun of destroying a family.
So that's Ruth Ramirez speaking in one of the videos that you produced. Could you say very quickly, Debbie Nathan, what happened?
She ended up in a deportation center not far from the reporter who you just interviewed, and she ultimately went back to Mexico, and she has 3 U.S. citizen, U.S.-born children who accompanied her, and a DACA-aged child who was just applying for DACA. They're all back in Mexico now.
We're going to leave it there, but congratulations on your very important work, and we'll continue to follow it. Debbie Nathan, investigative reporter for the ACLU of Texas. We'll link to her report in The Intercept, headlined, "They're Taking Everybody." Videos show Texas troopers ripping apart immigrant families during traffic stops. And this breaking news, South African anti-apartheid activist, former head of Greenpeace International, Kumi Naidoo, has been named the next Secretary General of Amnesty International. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.